All right. Hi, everyone.
Hey,
I'm so glad you're here. I am Melissa Adams from Tacoma Community College Library, and I'm here to share with you something that it's very much AI related, right? But I found as I was putting this presentation together, I found that there is so much more, and it's not really just an AI presentation. And I was really happy to follow Dr. Megan Sanders. Megan, if you're here, you said so many things that just segue right in to what I'm going to talk about today. And you also gave me a lot to think about too, so I really appreciate that. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. Now, I had asked all of you let's see if I can just grab that. I had asked all of you in my session space about whether, well, I'll just read it. Does your institution have a separate generative AI academic use policy? What I mean by separate is that are you letting, what we found was that our academic integrity policy just would cover so much about what students do or might do with generative AI, and not just our academic integrity policy, but any student conduct policy would cover anything that happened like that. So my use of separate here. And I wasn't very surprised by the outcomes here. Is that no, 65% don't have a separate policy, and this is campus wide. And yes, at 25%, and almost 10%, I don't know. So those are really, I think those are um, pretty typical numbers at this point from what I have found so far. And then I'm not going to go and grab this right now, just in the interest of time. But my second question was, if you do have a separate generative AI use policy, were students involved in that? And I think that came in at around 2% where students were directly involved in that policy. And that's going to get us to my presentation here. Let me grab that and share and slideshow. Let me hide. There we go. Oh, we were there. There we go. All right. So again, thank you for inviting me to participate in this institute, and thank you for being here, for taking your time to be here today. And I'm at the library at Tacoma Community College, one of the faculty librarians here, and I've been teaching since 1990, and in higher ed specifically since 2008. So it's not a huge surprise, except that maybe it's a little bit of surprise to me that I would have a rather all-consuming professional interest in the teaching and learning aspect of generative AI, um, especially when it came to working with my colleagues via my students a lot of the time. Um, I'm really happy to see you, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you what we've done at TCC and how we did it. And it took me a little while to figure out where to start with this session and where to go. And I mean, at its most basic, I could just tell you what we did and how we did it, and then leave it at that. And thank you for coming. And I think it's important to have the framework, however, of just, where you've been in the last year and a half, just the trudge through this unknown forest that we're walking through. So it's important to have the framework, since our work, the student work group, to develop a policy proposal for the academic use of generative AI has such a deep framework and context, both by its nature and by its design. And in many ways, this session is only tangentially about generative AI, I started to feel, but I wanted to start with a little timeline and trajectory that you will all recognize. And I'll take you on a short journey from March 2023 when everything seems to catch on fire and all became chaos, except that it didn't really. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. And that's with the general release of OpenAI's large language model generative AI tool, ChatGPT. Well, I was not the only person on campus who was curious about this or grappling with the significance of it, of the release of this tool. I was definitely interested in providing resources for understanding it as best as I could at that time, primarily for my colleagues at that time. And I wanted to leverage my own curiosity about it from an information science point of view, and ultimately feeling overwhelmed about where to start from the perspective of its place in practice, which is what we were concerned with, everybody was concerned with. Narrowing its current scope within teaching and learning was critical. For me, this wasn't itself unleashing chaos on higher education, teaching and learning, but it was exposing problems we in higher education had been ignoring to a certain extent. And the disruption, and not to minimize the disruption of this technology. It was more about our practice than about the tool itself. Same problems, different tool. And in short, this wasn't the first disruptive technology we've encountered, but it was extremely exposing. And my ultimate mantra shared by others was and is, we're teachers, so let's teach. And with our practice exposed to the harsher elements, this had become for me and many others an opportunity in teaching and learning to reflect on our practice and make productive changes to that practice that may or may not include the direct application of generative AI tools. But that is a whole different presentation and workshop, and has been, as I approach this teaching and learning opportunity and consider who knows more about opportunity than our students, the people we dedicate our skills, experience, hope, and time to. Over the months, I heard and read so much focus placed on what we were going to do, what policies we were going to put into place, what sanctions we were going to exact, what countermeasures and deterrents we were going to put into place. And meanwhile, our students had a lot of things to say and a lot of things that they were thinking about, needing, and doing. And what I found out over the quarters was that generally it wasn't what I or many of my colleagues were perceiving that our students were thinking, needing, and doing. And of course, several things were happening at once, as they do, right? And I'm sure you recognize this, especially in the early generative AI times, there was a fair bit of scrambling, and faculty were leveraging ChatGPT experimentally in their classrooms, and faculty were fretting it and grieving it and banning it and making some threats about it and calling for policies and procedures and for detectors as well. And upper administration was hoping someone was doing something about it. And that sounds a wee bit snarky, but in our case, it was simply accurate. And that may have been well placed, in fact. And students were left picking up the pieces of the situation, with some students using the tool, few understanding it, many more students not using the tool, and all students experiencing inconsistencies in instruction and policies related to the application of generative AI tools and academic integrity from instructor to instructor. And many students recognizing that AI will likely play a large role in their careers and wanting both guidance and education. So we were actually manufacturing chaos for ourselves and for our students, to be expected in early times of disruption. Many four-year universities immediately produce guidelines and policies for their faculty, and some for their students. Some were very good and some were not so great. in my opinion. One thing I was interested in was scope. A little later on, I started to realize that scope was an interesting thing to look at. I advised scope of use by students, excuse me. I advised many of my colleagues to learn at least the basics of how to use ChatGPT at that time in the context of their own assignments, and spend the quarter or maybe even the next observing what happens in their courses. Decide nothing now. Understand it first. Our students will show us what they need. And naturally, there was mixed reception on that. We want to do something. But we saw a lot of headlines about how this is the end of academics and higher ed as we know it. Well, maybe, but not in the next 11 weeks. So let's see what our students can teach us. So whether through conducting student workshops, which were requested by students, or teaching generative AI modules in both our college success courses and our information literacy credit courses, we were finding out from students that, one, as a group, many students hadn't given much thought about how it applied to them. Here's a student quote from one of my assignments. I didn't know much about how LLMs were trained, and I didn't think about my relationship as a student with AI. So they haven't given much thought about how it applied to them, or were often less knowledgeable about generative AI than many of their instructors, which was a good direction for that to go in. One of my students comments, I thought any use of ChatGPT was cheating. To be fair, many of my teachers and professors have said that any use of ChatGPT is cheating. And I went way ahead here. There we go. Before this exercise on generative AI and generative AI and academic integrity, I thought that AI was fact-checked information. So sorry about that. Many students had been led to believe that there is no legitimate academic use of generative AI, which is a shame, and I read that one already. They thought that any use was cheating, in part because that's what they were told, but also it was hard to see our way out of that. How can it be used in a legitimate way? And as a group, no matter what I was doing, no matter what class I was teaching, what workshop I was given that as a group, students were often far more conservative about the use of generative AI than many of their instructors thought, and for different reasons than their instructors thought. It wasn't the threat of academic misconduct that was keeping their students, the students that I was talking to, from substituting generative AI outputs as their own work, but that students want to do their own learning work. The student says, even then, I still believe that if there is something you lack skills in, you should just learn how to do it. And that way you don't have to rely on technology rather than yourself. I've had several colleagues say things to me such as, well, that's what they say, but what do they really do? Fair. We all know about self-reported data. However, I noticed that out of your class of 25, you were telling me that 2 students are using AI to substitute for their own learning work. So I'd say that 23 of your students are really telling you what they're doing. And all 25 students are telling you something. I also want to note here that this has been consistent across my own and my non-computer science colleague experiences, because they were teaching it, right, as a part of their course. When students are taught how to leverage a generative AI tool and given the choice to use it in a specific assignment, a majority of students choose not to use a generative AI tool. I was so disappointed when this started happening. I really wanted to see what would happen. But I also, in my classes, I felt I couldn't mandate the use of it. So will any of this change? Well, probably. What we do now is important to the probably aspect of that. Between student-requested workshops and students favorably engaged in coursework about and with generative AI and sharing their interesting ideas and their use habits with us, requesting more consistent, more instructive policies, and requesting education on generative AI generally, I felt like it was time to finally look into developing a campus-wide generative AI academic use policy proposal. I was not in a hurry to do this prior. One, we have a new instructional academic integrity policy in place. Most of what students could get up to with the misuse of generative AI is going to be covered under academic integrity policies and under other student conduct policies that would fall out of academic use. And I felt like we should spend some time paying attention to what other colleges are doing around us and what our students do. But I still had policy, and the key for me here was instructive policy that centered student agency in the back of my mind since early on in March 2023. I became acquainted with Boston University's student-developed generative AI use policy. I knew that if I were to facilitate a policy proposal, I would want it to be student-developed. And if you aren't yet familiar, Boston University's policy was produced within an undergraduate course, a 300-level course, as a quarter-long project, developed within the context of the subject of the course, data, society, and ethics. I believe it was the first of its kind, or near first. And it was and is a great idea. I think that generative AI use is a policy particularly well suited to, and in fact in need of, authentic student input. Like everything I refer to in this presentation, you can find links to that policy and information about the development of this policy in Whova and in the last slide here. And at this point, I'm going to get into how we went from having no policy development to having a student-driven campus-wide policy proposal. Right now, I want to give some attention to my dean and fellow librarian, Dale Coleman. Dale has furnished me with what feels like to me an endless reservoir of support for many of my shenanigans, but chiefly this project, which has some risk inherent to it, so support is critical. Before we even started recruiting students for this project, the important aspect here is that Dale contacted stakeholders at TCC to ensure that a student-driven policy proposal would be considered, just like any other policy proposal, so that students would have a motivating, authentic, and satisfying experience. Then Dale found the money, the funding resources from our own division to some extent, but primarily through the Office of Student Engagement. And this is directed by Sonia Morgan and the money is managed by Ron L. Bayless. We had lots of conversations. So with stakeholders, commitment, and funding secured, then we were free to get to work on this. When we decided to move forward, it was late in winter 2024. And I knew that I wanted to start with a group of students and end with them. So we had good continuity and have a product at the end. So soon. Why the rush? Students were now those asking for a policy. So I felt like we needed to get to one pretty soon for those students. So for Dale and me, the only thing that made sense with those criteria was a single quarter spring 2024 project, 11 weeks to develop a policy. With that, a project-based course was not going to happen, of course, and wasn't really considered anyway. So we decided on a quarter-long work group where students would be paid $20 an hour to participate. Working with our student government, chiefly Vice President Molly Kuwahara, we put out an open call for students to apply to be work group members. And we left the application form open for just 10 days near the end of winter 2024 quarter. And I included the work group syllabus and the schedule in that call for participation so that students knew exactly what they were committing to before they applied. And we received, in that short time, we received just under 40 applicants. And I use the term apply loosely. Students were selected on a first come, first served basis. And between list order and then timely confirmations with us, we started with 15 students. Ultimately, we had 13 students who stayed on as the project got started. And originally I wanted a group of 12 students, so overloading to 15 got us to my target group number, but had all 15 stayed, that would have been great too. I mentioned that up front, students were given a kind of syllabus for the project, as this was effectively a class they were getting paid to take. They met 2 hours per week in a workshop, with some outside workshop hours being paid as well. Dale Coleman and I wanted the students, whoops, I keep forgetting about that part. Dale Coleman and I wanted the students who were developing policy to be, quote, smarter than the resulting policy, which is what we should all strive for in our policies, which required background knowledge and broader context about generative AI policies and teaching and learning. And what follows here is a distillation of their quarter-long schedule again, and the syllabus is also being made available in Whova and in a QR code at the end of this presentation. So during week 1, aside from the usual team making and icebreakers and that kind of thing, we started learning about policies in general, starting with the notion that policies are meant to solve problems. So students brainstormed lists of what problems they thought a generative AI use policy is meant to solve, why, and for who. The next week, Dale got into the details of the policy process at TCC and institutional issues in policy development, including bias, and a host of other institutional isms. And throughout the next few weeks, the students and I worked a great deal on evaluation of policies generally, and specifically TCC core syllabus policies on the use of generative AI. One of for me, it was a foundational article, and I was handing these out like flyers on the streets of New York City to any of my colleagues who would take it. So one of my colleagues, Aaron Korf, forwarded this bit of research to me that gathered and evaluated campus-wide generative AI policies from 30 major universities. And this article made me really glad that we didn't jump right into forming a campus-wide policy, that we had laid back a little bit. So if you haven't read it already, I deeply encourage you to read this article. And I won't go into detail here, but the researcher evaluated the policies, and this is critical to what the students are going to do. The researcher evaluated the policies using something called the WPR framework, which is, what is the problem represented to be in a policy? Not only was this article incredibly useful to our policy development, it was a wonderful experience giving students space to wrestle with an academic question, not what is the problem, but what is the problem represented to be, which calls for deep critical thinking. Earlier in winter 2024, I asked all faculty to share their generative AI course policies with me. So we had a stock of 20 classroom policies to evaluate using that article and the WPR framework, what is the problem represented to be, as our guide. And we developed our own WPR-based instrument to evaluate aspects of these classroom policies, including, of course, what is the problem represented to be, what assumptions or silences are present. Are the policies more punitive or more instructive? Do they center student agency and competency or not, and more? And once the students got the hang of this way of thinking, they really enjoyed being researchers for a while and discovered several moving insights about the policies our students find in classes. One thing we valued for our students was placing generative AI, LLM development, and use in context. We had and many of you mentioned this in the chat in Megan Sanders' presentation. We had 3 disciplined faculty do a series of speed lectures on generative AI and economics from Rob Larson, generative AI and the environment, Katrina Taylor, and generative AI and ethics from Aaron Korf. And this gave students so much to think about and fired them up to contextualize their future policy proposals for their fellow students. The week after was a faculty roundtable. 6 faculty and 1 writing tutor joined us, and participants got to hear from each other on questions such as, what is your ideal teaching and learning relationship? There was a lot of vulnerability in the room, both from students and faculty. Our student work group had a Canvas space that had weekly discussion forums, and here is an abridged post reenactment from one student about the roundtable experience. I can see now how this generative AI is just as much unknown territory for them, the teachers, as it is for students. And I trust that there is much more good intention than not. I have much more empathy for teachers and faculty than I started. This will definitely apply to my thinking as we build the policy. I use these discussion forums as an informal assessment of how things were going, and this was a win for sure. It didn't matter to me so much what students said in these discussion forums, but I wanted to know what impact the contextualizing information might have on their approach to policy development process. So this was one example of gold in here. The next weeks were finally dedicated to the work of policy development, at the end of which we had a solid draft. And students were experiencing kind of a wax on, wax off situation that quarter. So they weren't sure that they were going to be able to produce a draft. But I kept reassuring them, all of the things that you've been doing is getting you more than halfway there. Once you start working on the policy, it's going to go pretty quickly. So they mostly trusted the process and they surprised themselves. And the students presented their work at both the final, excuse me, at both the final student senate meeting and at our final president's town hall meeting of the year. And then, of course, we had a wrap party, which included placing the policy into the TCC policy proposal template. That doesn't sound very fun, but it was. And that was exciting for them. It was that final touch. They were done. Aside, if all goes well, the policy could be adopted by mid-winter 2025. And students who are still at TCC, many of them graduated, will be invited back to ferry it through the process and to design where it lives online, which will include lots of instructive materials and resources about generative AI in the global context and also academic context. Going back just a bit, I want to go back to the time when students were gaining the knowledge and skills to develop policy. One workshop session, they were tasked to brainstorm a list of characteristics or content they wanted to make sure is a part of their policy. And then we revisited this a few times as we went on in the future weeks. We first discussed, well, why go through all of this? Why not just adopt Boston University's policy? And they took this question very seriously, and they ran it through our WPR framework and their own contextualized learning about generative AI. And one thing they noticed is that the policy was already a little dated in the specifics, and they didn't want that to happen to their policy. They felt that Boston University served as a great model and an inspiration, but they knew that the TCC community needed their own from the ground up. And here's a partial list of features they brainstormed that were important to them, things they would be proud to claim as a policy proposal. Plain language and brevity came up a lot, as was honoring and enabling student agency and competency. They had seen many more punitive policies and many more proscriptive policies. So having an instructional prescriptive policy was important to them. At the same time, not overly prescriptive. They wanted the policy to see the whole student who has aspirations, challenges, pressures, needs outside of being a college student. And students felt strongly that actively writing an anti-bias policy was critically important. Students learned that policies do become obsolete with time and need reviewed and updated, especially policies that have anything to do with technology. So students wanted to make sure the policy was flexible enough and not overly detailed enough to not become dated the moment it is adopted. They valued this, especially as a feature of their policy, to demonstrate that they were smarter than the policy. They love that phrase, that they had sufficient knowledge of the background and the context of the problem to write a relevant policy. And originally, we thought of this as a student policy formed by students, but students wanted it to apply to faculty and staff also. And they wanted to encourage faculty knowledge of generative AI. The students generally came in a little hot on this feature of the policy, but then we had some parallel learning discussions about academic freedom and why they need to fight for it as much or even more than faculty themselves do. And in the end, they did a great job in the faculty focus section. I hope you will agree, as it highlights the teaching and learning team between faculty and students. And after they had made their list, revisited it several times and consolidated it and prioritized, they had a look at these practical policy guidelines from Boise State and also this useful, innovative policy rubric from a course at McGill University. Again, these are available in the Whova space and in a QR code at the end. And students were so gratified that their ideas were validated by outside sources, that they could recognize features of their work with the WPR framework present in these guidelines from Boise and this rubric from this course. They leaned heavily on both of these as documents as they developed their policy. Okay, so down to some bottom lines. Here are a few things and lesson learns, and the bottom line that will come up for most people is, how much did this cost? Students were paid $20 an hour for 2 hours per week of workshop time and 3 hours per week of outside work, such as reading, researching, editing shared docs, discussion forum posts, and things like that, which they took very seriously, all of that, including doing their own research and learning things that we didn't cover. OSE covered student payment. There was also food, of course, provided by my department. So thanks to Dale again and Patty Hermosa, I think this came in at around $500. Well, I had communicated that they would have 3 hours of, here's a couple of lessons learned here. While I had communicated that they would have 3 hours of outside time to spend as they needed for the project, that for me, kind of silly, was for the whole quarter, 3 hours. And I stated this and it was written down in various places, but about half of them misinterpreted this to mean that it was 3 hours per week of outside work. in addition to their 2 weekly workshop hours, which I did not find out about until late midterm. So many students were working for free. We ended up paying all of them for the 3 hours per week of outside work. So that turned out just fine. Knowing what I know now, I would make it a flat 7 hours for the entire quarter and have them read and sign an agreement so I know that they know and they don't end up working for free. I was moving a little faster than I should have several times. The most detrimental was skimping on group norming in our first meeting. And although we did have a tight team soon enough, some early team frustrations could have been mitigated from this. And I know better. This was so much work. It was, after all, a course I was teaching, and I wish that I had the foresight to arrange for some release time. And I am a terrible documentarian. Really, the pictures you see here are pretty much the pictures that I took. So I can't even remember to take photos of my own kids most of the time. So I wish I had scheduled media to come in a few times and to schedule marketing to come in and take some really good photos periodically. It's great for documenting a process, but also motivating for most of the students as well to be valued in that particular way. Generally, I wish I had a better sense of the structure and time that students wanted or needed to do their best. Originally, I had them come in for an hour per week, which was so silly. After week 2, the students asked me for 2 hours of workshop time per week, so we did. And I also think I assumed too much about their intellectual needs. As much as these students were random, they were self-selected, generally highly motivated students, and I made some assumptions about them getting it. They get it, right? So there were some times when students were a little frustrated because I wasn't connecting the dots more explicitly for them or teaching them things such as how to really read and use a rubric effectively. There was a fair amount of backtracking, and they were awfully good sports. As usual, I learned a lot from students, not all of it about the topic we were studying. And I also wanted to squeeze in here and say that I adored these folks. They really care about not only their own college experience, but the experiences of other students. And arguably, they are living under incredibly complex and they are living under incredible complexity and uncertainty. And I think that being encouraged and provided with supportive space to step in and step up is particularly attractive, reassuring, and validating. As much as this was a kind of class, it was an amazing opportunity to have a working and teaching and learning relationship with students on a project that directly benefits the entire college and moves it forward in a time of disruption. They're so proud of their work, what they can accomplish and what they have learned. And I also told them that their policy is going to get attention outside of TCC, and they hadn't thought of that, and they were a bit dazzled by that idea. Oh, I thought I put on my watch. Oh, good, we're good on time. And now I kind of questions and discussions. I would love to answer any questions you have, and I'm interested to learn where I want to see if I just made it in. Oh no, I had a little. I'm so sorry. I had a little. Oh, here it is. Okay, I'm sorry, everybody. Oh, I even tried this out. Oh, I'm really sorry, everyone. Oh, here we go. Here's my video of our policy. So this policy is not intended to be comprehensive or overly prescriptive. Students wanted that straight out of the gate. And this policy serves as a resource for the community who have questions about the responsible use that is clearly not expressed elsewhere on campus or in classroom policies, right? And I think that Megan Sanders mentioned that, is that all faculty have the right to present that how they want, but this policy was put in place where there might not otherwise be policy. So where present, students must refer to and follow policy and instructions in their syllabi. Students should cite their own use of generative AI, and include a description of their use of generative AI where the tool is used that is part of graded work. And students are expected to use other sources other than generative AI outputs as sources for their academic work. And this was especially, can I pause this here? When students are experiencing difficulty completing coursework that meets rigor and academic integrity expectations, they should seek help. Students should seek help from these resources before turning to generative AI to replace and stand in for their own knowledge work. And again, Megan Sanders mentioned this too. Students assume responsibility for information that is applied to their own work. Then we move on to the faculty. The faculty should include clear, instructive, well-designed generative AI policies in both syllabi and their assigned work, which feels like a pretty safe, place to be on that. And this is going to get a little bit of controversy here. After all, it is just a policy. Students wanted to kind of go for broke here. Faculty should be cautious in their use of plagiarism and generative AI detection tools, which are unreliable and often provide false positives. In addition, these tools can introduce bias and inequity into educational assessment processes by favoring students who are more skilled with generative AI or those who can afford the added benefit of subscription generative AI tools. And this policy generally discouraged the use of these detection tools. And part of the reason that I felt okay about including this was that University of Michigan, I believe it is, actually has a statement in their generative AI is that as a campus, they do not support the use of detection tools. All right. Thank you. Now here we are. I think I got a little uptight there that I didn't do this right. I would love to answer any questions you have, and I'm interested to learn where you are at your institution on generative AI academic use policy. If you have one in place, how did you arrive at it? If you don't, is this a conscious decision? And do you feel like your institution needs one? Why or why not? I think there's a lot open there. I'm gonna go grab chat here and see if we have any questions. Jeff, thank you. Oh, let's see. I know it's validating to know others from Dr. Sanders across the education realm are on the same page as far as AI policies go. I know, Megan, it sort of felt like it was hard to get there, right? But we see that it's happening. Jeff Kane, thank you so much. I think this is a great policy. And TCC is so proud of the work this group did. They did a heavy lift that was, I agree. And thank you, Jessica, for your words there that you love this. And thank you, Katie. My pleasure. And I got a message from somebody in Hoover who would like to talk to me, and I love talking to people. So please let me know. And I'm going to, rather than unshare right now, I'm going to put my email address up there and also the QR code to get to the student-led policy development kit, the things that we relied on to help us develop this policy, the kinds of things that we felt were important to provide us with the context and guidance that we needed to develop this policy. So I'm going to stop sharing here and see what we have going from people. Any questions or comments, and I can get back into the chat too if anybody would like to put your question in chat.
Yeah, I had Tula sent me a direct message that said that she thought it was an excellent idea to have the students create this, and that's kind of that's kind of what I'm interested in these policies. And we have an AI task force that's drafting policy, and I think we need to find some way to bring more student voices into that process. So this is a very timely presentation for us, and I'm looking forward to bringing this back. for our
Yeah.
AI task force over at Clover Park.
Yeah. Thank you. And plus, for anybody who's lucky enough to get to do this, this was so fun. This was the best part of my quarter. And it wasn't just because I was on the contract negotiation team. It would have been the best part of my quarter, no matter what. And I request to put the QR code back up. Yes, and you will also find that in the Whova space as well. Let me get back to that. And you don't need to see me to ask questions for sure. Jeff, you said you had a couple of, was that the summarized?
That was the comments that and then also just I think that's really the whole you know having the students being integrated into that process. I think is really powerful.
Yeah,
You know,
it was.
versus what we do is we typically come up with a policy and then send a copy to the you know the student body government. You know, they read this at a meeting and give us your feedback, and that's not enough.
Right. One thing that was really funny about taking this to the student government, because they wanted to, see how it was going. After all, out of OSC was a lot of money coming to do this, but they weren't really concerned about that. They just wanted to see how it was going. It is so hard to keep a group of students on task when you want to present something like just here's our policy and here's how we did and here's some things that we thought about. The students wanted to launch into debates about generative AI.
Right.
So, I mean, also what that told me is that, I mean, students are just ready to go, right? They want to talk about this and in whatever capacity they wanted. Something just so delightful happened in this just first come first serve application. We had just such a statistical sampling of students from across campus. I was blown away by just how representative the group was of students across campus. And you may have seen a picture. We even had a baby. We had students from other countries, um, you know, students with a variety of needs. It was just so fantastic to have that experience and that turned out really well. And I actually had a point that, the other thing that we got really lucky with is that we had a variety of stances on generative AI. That same student said, whoa, I'm really glad to hear the faculty perspective, and it's really changed my thinking on this. That same student came in pretty hot on using generative AI, and it was the thing that we should all be doing. And after he was hearing the environmental impacts of generative AI and, ethical and economic impacts, he really changed by the end of that. But still, we had students who were really, thought it was the best thing ever. And we had one student who still had a flip phone and was not interested at all. And I think she said this in the town hall. She said they were asking the students why they decided to join this group, and she said that she something to the effect of, well, when our AI overlords come to take us over, she felt like she needed to be a voice in the room. the the against voice in the room. So they were a great bunch of people.
All right. Do we have any more comments, final comments, questions? Okay, so we're at time. Melissa, thank you so much for presenting. We really appreciate your support for this AI Institute. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it and have a great day.
All right, you too.